In recent years, a wave of new political energy has emerged from the African continent. Among the most striking figures at the center of this awakening is Ibrahim Traoré, the young and outspoken leader of Burkina Faso. His speeches, his ideas, and above all, his courage to stand up to long-established powers have captured international attention. When he introduced the concept of what has now become popularly known as the Afro-Money Plan, many in the West were taken aback. The proposal was bold, unapologetic, and uncompromising. It was a direct challenge to centuries of financial control imposed on Africa by outside forces. Some saw it as naive, others as revolutionary. But the most surprising reaction, the one that set headlines ablaze, was the reported silence of Donald Trump himself, a man known for having something to say about everything. The notion that Trump could be left speechless by an African leader's proposal was a moment that electrified people around the world. The Afro-Money Plan was not simply a slogan. At its heart, it was a strategy for independence. For decades, African nations have struggled with currencies tied to former colonial powers, locked into financial systems that drain wealth out of the continent rather than allow it to flourish within. Traoré, representing a new generation of African leadership, sought to change that. His plan called for a new financial order where African countries could unite under a shared currency or at least develop a coordinated system of trade free from the manipulation of external powers. Such a move, if successful, would not only give Africa greater economic freedom, but also rewrite the rules of global trade. When Trump heard of this plan, sources claimed, he was uncharacteristically silent. The man who was always ready with a quick insult, a dismissive phrase, or a boastful retort seemed, for once, to be caught off guard. Why would Trump be stunned? Because the plan threatened to unravel the very structures that America, along with Europe, had long relied on to maintain global dominance. For Trump, who prided himself on being a dealmaker and a defender of American supremacy, the thought of Africa rising with its own financial system was not only unexpected, but deeply unsettling. This silence spoke volumes. It was more than a reaction to one man's idea. It revealed the growing cracks in the old global order. For decades, Africa was treated as a supplier of raw materials, a market for finished goods, and a stage for foreign powers to play their games of influence. Leaders who resisted were often overthrown, discredited, or marginalized. But Traoré's Afro-Money Plan symbolized a shift. It was not just about Burkina Faso, it was about the continent reclaiming its destiny. Trump's inability to brush it off showed that even the most powerful figures in the West recognized the seriousness of this new momentum. The plan itself was ambitious. It envisioned African nations pooling resources to stabilize a shared currency that would no longer be tied to the dollar, the euro, or the French franc. It called for creating regional banks controlled by Africans, not by Paris, London, or Washington. It emphasized the importance of intra-African trade, breaking the reliance on exporting to the West. Imagine if African oil, gold, cobalt, and cocoa were priced in an African currency instead of the dollar. Imagine if the billions spent by African governments on infrastructure were financed through African institutions rather than loans from the IMF or World Bank. The Afro-Money Plan sought to make those dreams a reality. For Trump, who had built his political brand on the idea of America first, the idea of Africa first was almost incomprehensible. He had long mocked developing nations, describing them in derogatory terms. He had argued that the United States should always out-negotiate, always out-muscle, always dictate the terms of trade. Yet here was a young African leader daring to propose a system where America would no longer call the shots. The shock was not just about economics, it was about pride, ego, and the shifting balance of power. As Traoré delivered his vision, audiences across Africa cheered. To many, he was not just a politician, but a symbol of defiance. He represented the possibility that Africa could finally break free from the chains of dependency. He spoke of dignity, of reclaiming identity, and of a future where African children would grow up knowing their continent was not poor, but rich in resources, culture, and innovation. The Afro Money Plan was more than currency, it was a declaration of freedom. The reaction in the West, however, was mixed. Some economists dismissed it as impossible. They argued that African countries were too divided, too economically unstable, too dependent on foreign aid to ever pull off such a radical transformation. But history is full of examples where ideas once considered impossible eventually reshaped the world. The creation of the euro was met with skepticism, yet today it is one of the most powerful currencies. Why could Africa not achieve something similar? Others warned that if Africa succeeded, it would mark the decline of Western dominance over global trade. Trump's silence lingered in the public imagination. People wondered, was he truly speechless, or was he quietly plotting how to counter this unexpected challenge? Knowing Trump's style, some speculated he might lash out later, calling the plan ridiculous or branding Traoré as irrelevant. But in that initial moment, the shock was undeniable. It was a reminder that the world was changing faster than anyone anticipated. Beyond the symbolism, the Afro Money Plan struck at the heart of a deeper issue: sovereignty. For too long, African nations had been independent in name, but not in practice. Their political borders were drawn by colonizers. Their economies were structured to serve foreign masters. Even after independence, many countries continued to use currencies tied to their former rulers. Traoré's proposal was a way of reclaiming true independence, and if successful, it would inspire other regions of the world to do the same. Latin America, Asia, and even parts of Europe could look to Africa and see a model for resisting the dominance of the dollar. Trump may have been left speechless, but millions of Africans found their voices in Traoré's words. The Afro Money Plan ignited debates in universities, coffee shops, government halls, and rural villages. People began to ask, what if we stopped exporting our wealth and started investing in ourselves? What if we valued our own resources in our own terms? What if we no longer had to beg for loans, but could stand as equals on the global stage? These were not just economic questions, they were questions of identity, dignity, and destiny. As with any bold idea, challenges lay ahead. Building a unified currency requires political will, economic coordination, and trust among nations that have often been divided by conflict or corruption. There were risks of inflation, instability, and foreign interference. Western powers would not sit idly by as Africa sought to break free. History had shown that leaders who challenged the status quo often faced immense resistance. Yet the very fact that the Afro Money Plan was being discussed was a victory in itself. It meant that the imagination of Africa was no longer confined to the limitations imposed by others. Trump's silence thus became a metaphor. It symbolized the inability of old powers to understand the new world emerging before them. It showed that the arrogance of assuming Africa would forever remain passive was misplaced. Traoré and others like him were reshaping narratives, and in doing so, they were reshaping the future. The story of Trump being left speechless by the Afro Money Plan will likely be told for years as a turning point, not because of Trump himself, but because of what it represented. It was a moment when Africa's voice grew louder, when its leaders dared to dream bigger, and when even the most outspoken figure in American politics found himself without words.